Hello, everybody. My name is John Enoch. I run what we in AWS call cloud economics in Europe, which is one of these wonderful terms as a job description that nobody understands and which you can have a lot of leeway. And I tend to view it as being a lot more than looking at cost analysis. It's looking at how people see their decisions and how we can hopefully help them make better ones. And this is the last session for all of you today. It's Halloween. It's the graveyard shift. Thank you very much for turning up. So a lot of times, I don't know, was anyone here at my session this morning where I got in at the last minute to do something on TCO? Was anyone here? Great. OK, well, a lot of people focus too much on TCO, and you sometimes hear people say, well, it's all about the money. We're going to make a decision, it's all about the money. But the reality is, it's not. People don't make decisions based on one factor of value. They're based on multiple objectives. There's always trade-offs, there's always personalities, there's always bias, and there's a lot of emotion, and especially in something like cloud adoption. So if we're going to look at, why some companies can move fast to the cloud and some companies don't change very much of anything, we look at how people make decisions. So I thought I'd start by giving you a riddle. And if you know the answer very quickly, please just shout out a number, all right? 5 frogs are sitting on a log. 4 frogs decide to jump off. How many frogs are left? Anybody? 5. Well, you're really good. That's exactly the right answer. Because they all decided, but they didn't actually jump. So you could look at this also with the likes of any big decision. People inject their interpretation of what they hear, and they don't really think too much about the difference between individuals deciding to do something and a group of people actually doing it. So we have to look at the way in which they see risk, their preference in outcome, and their behaviors when they make decisions. So over the next 40 minutes, I've got really 3 things I'm going to put out to you for your thought. First of all, cloud is a window of opportunity. So as an example earlier of, to date myself, along with the Jurassic period, I started my career in PC telex. And I used to run the office in Vietnam for a company that had a $200 million run rate in telex with banks. And the CEO was asked by some technical people, what about the internet? His response was, no bank will ever connect to the internet. His window of opportunity was then. He didn't do anything. 3 years later, the whole business was gone. So no illusion with cloud. We've already seen so many cases where cloud adopters disrupt. Netflix versus Blockbuster is the most obvious one. So perhaps there is less time to make decisions, and perhaps there is, as KPMG call it, the inertia tax at play when looking at decisions, and that shouldn't be underestimated. Back to frogs, the boiling frog. Another thing, I used to come from the risk management industry. So I've worked for 2 of the big 4 in risk management. And I hope that gives me the opportunity to have a personal perspective, which is, it doesn't work. If anyone disagrees, let me know. For early 2000s, I was doing Sir Barnes-Oxley work, PwC. 2008, all the banks crashed. So how would you know if risk management is working or not working? You know if a car's working because the engine's running and it's going forward. How would you know? How would you actually get a feel for whether it's working, or if it's actually a complete waste of time, perhaps even worse than a waste of time? Perhaps you're investing time and money in something that you'd be better off, I don't know, doing astrology or reading tea leaves or something. So what if it worked, and what could that GRC function properly do? So they do have a role. They are very good people, and they're very thorough. Perhaps they could be better applied. Also, we're going to put forward the view that organizations that adopt cloud at scale are far more likely to be better at managing risk than the ones that don't. And the reason I say that is that cloud tends to simplify. it subtracts more than it adds, and it consolidates, so you have more access to information. So the traditional view of risk, where you're ticking off on risk and compliance frameworks, and you've got your list of controls, and you're personally, subjectively assessing their effectiveness. It's very static, isn't it? That doesn't really reflect the world we live in, where everything happens in almost real time. That's a very, very snapshot view of the world, and I personally think it's very flawed. So if you're not doing that, maybe your whole 3 lines of defense with your compliance people, your IT risk people, and your operational people, maybe they do a lot more together and a lot faster. So first of all, let's going to talk a little bit about how people view risk. So risk appetite, we have a disposition to a certain level of risk. Risk perception, how we interpret our world. There's a very interesting study from Journal of Personality and Social Psychology from a while back about what happens when you put people in positions where they have no control and how they react. So as an example, I made the mistake last February of going on an away day with an AWS team, actually the partners team, where I was told it's going to be a walk through a canyon. We all walked through a canyon for about half an hour, and then the path ended, and it was a 70-meter drop. Then we realized it was abseiling, and I'm very afraid of heights. And the guide said, first person down should either be the most confident or the most terrified. So I just went for it, and I was just like, I'm going over the edge. Now, I was in that sort of yellow zone, very appropriate, of people who were very afraid because they have no control, they have no certainty on the outcome. There was one woman there from our marketing department who was swinging around like she was on special forces. She was insane, she'd never done it before, she's far braver than I am. And we had some people who were angry, and they had a positive energy of being angry. Now, with cloud adoption, it's very similar. You have a lot of people who are not quite sure what to do, what change means for them, and they're genuinely afraid. They have genuine concerns. You have some people who are very angry that things are going to change, and they fight it. And you have some who go with it. What I found was, as I went down the side of this cliff, it kind of dawned on me that I have a rope that I control. There's a professional there with a rope on me that he controls, and as long as I don't look down and I just go inch by inch, I'm going to get to the bottom. And after I'd done that once, I did it 4 more times, and I really enjoyed it. So you convert people from being afraid to being enthusiasts. And when we look at any of the major case studies for mass cloud adoption, we always see the same thing, that they start off in a position where most people are afraid, and then those fears are addressed and they're taken seriously, and most people then become enthusiasts. And there's a very good quote from Fabio Veronesi, who's the head of IT at Enel. This is at our reInvent last year, where he said that cloud adoption is not a technology decision, it's a business decision. And one of the problems with what I think we see in the market is it's very much approached from the perspective of how we move to cloud, very much a technology decision. Maybe with a lump of TCO thrown in because it's apparently all about the money. Well, it's not. It's about how people view risk and how they collectively make decisions that reflect their risk appetite and perception. So let's look at this as a change. So why make a change? Why move to cloud? If you ask people, you get a number of different answers. Here are a few of the ones which I find are most common. So people with Star Wars toys on their desks will say it's fun. People who are a little bit more, serious in their jobs might be just saying, well, I've got to do it. Some might say, this is going to be building my CV and getting me to the next level. And some might have some sort of mantra like, we have a cloud-first strategy, or it's part of our digital transformation initiative. They haven't really thought about what those words mean. They've just been told they've got them. Well, maybe a better answer would be to say, because change delivers more value than it costs, and perhaps even that the status quo is unsustainable. That whole boiling frog analogy, that telex company I used to work for, they had no idea that the status quo was unsustainable, and the CEO had a vested interest in the status quo. Very happy with it, anchored in it. Huge amounts of bias, no external advice. So we always recommend getting objective opinions. So how can we be sure that change delivers more value than it costs, and how can we get a group of people to hopefully see the same problem in the same way? Well, we're in an interesting point of the cloud phenomenon. We've gone from these early adopter, very tech-savvy companies through now into these large cloud adoption case studies like Enel, Capital One, British Petroleum, Scotia Gas Networks. We've got number of these which are continuing to flow through. And they're very much those early adopters. Now, isn't it interesting, if you look at a risk-reward utility curve, you kind of match it to Geoffrey Moore's crossing the chasm. So we have been dealing with a lot of people who are risk-seeking. They're the kind of people who would jump off the edge of a cliff. We're not going to trivialize the complexity. And we're now moving, I think, into that far bigger group of the early majority where you hit a tipping point and everything happens, just like with the internet. Now, one of the things to be aware of with that early majority, I mentioned earlier windows of opportunity. When I talk to people in the real estate industry, specifically data center real estate, they all say the same thing, which is when they talk to CFOs and CEOs, the issue around data centers is not so much cloud, not cloud, private cloud versus blah, blah, blah. Not that at all. The big issue is the book value of their IT assets, especially data centers, are very high. And they're depreciated over a period of time. Data centers can be depreciated over 15, 20 years. Whilst that depreciation line is going down as a gradual slope, the market value of those IT assets is nosediving. So you have a huge, great gap between book value and market value, and that starts to look like an issue that auditors should be very concerned about because that impacts the valuation of businesses, stock prices and that. So we may end up, I'm just saying, may end up in a situation where it becomes an imperative to exit the data center. And if that happens, I question whether anyone in the cloud industry, all of our, AWS, all of our competitors, all of our partners, whether anyone is ready to scale to a huge stampede to cloud. It could happen. So window of opportunity is not just competitive pressure, it could even be ability to execute. So why do people do things and not do things? When we look at cloud, these are the things which I will normally hear coming up as reasons why somebody is concerned about the change of the move to cloud. And the really interesting thing with this list is I hear exactly the same list when people are talking about reasons to move to cloud. So Scotia Gas Networks talking about improved security posture by moving to cloud. Knowledge. I've heard a CTO of a bank say that when they've moved to AWS, if they're having graduate intake and they're asked which platform are you developing on, and they don't have to say something like C++, and they can say we're going cloud, they get a lot more of the best people. The gap between book and market value is huge, and the knowledge one, I think, are huge. Lock-in, I think, is a little bit of it's a bit of a perception. We have, as AWS, tools to get into cloud, tools to get out of cloud, but really it's specialization. So again, it could be a positive, it could be a negative, depending on how you view each of these. But the bottom one is absolutely a negative. So it's not really just about the numbers and TCO and the like, it's about people. So people have biases. So we have things like, for example, anchoring, where they're so familiar with something, they tend to think that everything applies there. It's representative. They've also got overconfidence, which is very, very common. So everything in IT is going to work fine, the project will be successful, my CV is fantastic, and I have a dream team, nothing can go wrong, and black swans don't exist. We will have that sort of hubris, that sort of, hey, bad things don't happen to good people, we're good people, our projects will be successful. Well, we know it doesn't work like that. People underestimate cost and they underestimate risk. So we want to make sure that in the early stages of any sort of big decision, we focus on those things. Also, people don't always see the same problem in the same way. I'll give an example shortly, but you tend to get the outcome of either the loudest person in the room, or you get the outcome of a group of people who have come together with consensus, which is ideal. And the last point of this, with MPV. time and delay have a cost. MPV doesn't really capture it. You want to have something which will give you a view of the risk of delay. So for example, it takes time to execute an IT project. If it will be faster to do things on cloud and you don't have that delay, you're not investing that time. I heard from one of our partners, Red Oak Consulting, that on a high-performance computing project, you lose 1% of the value of your project for every week of delay. So these things can delay for many weeks. So you have a, as they say, a tax on inertia, and you have a certain decision paralysis when people can't see the same problem in the same way. So here's an example of what happens when you get different people looking at the same problem in a different way, different perceptions of risk and outcomes. It's from the astronaut Alan Shepard. It's very sobering to be up in space and realize one's safety factor was determined by the lowest bidder on a government contract. So for the astronaut, the business user effectively gets to the moon, get back safely. NASA, build a cheap rocket. Now, we all know what happened with Apollo 13, so he was a very brave man. But the point is, both were correct. So unless you've got some trade-offs at play, nothing's going to happen. And the biggest risk, in my view, is probably decision paralysis. So let's have a look at decision paralysis. It's very closely linked to the availability of data. So when I work with AWS customers and account managers, I usually ask for a self-assessment of how ready the customer is to execute change. For example, if you had all the people involved with the decision, with all their risk perceptions, all their knowledge, if you stuck them in a room at 12 noon and said, all agree where to go for lunch by 12:15, could they do it? Are they capable of being decisive? Now, there's the famous J.P. Cotter 8 elements of change management. I don't think we need all 8. I put it down to about 7, which I think apply. And the picture here is an average that I've taken from the responses that I've had. And it's interesting because there's a quote there from FSN, a research company, that a lot of companies are still relying on gut feel, and they're not getting the right results. Gut feel, intuition, very biased. If you have the right information, you're probably going to make a much better decision. Pretty obvious. So there's a lot of winging it out there. And what we're seeing is this. Leadership are very clear that the direction of travel is towards cloud. It's not towards building stuff. C-level -1 or 2 have legitimate concerns, or maybe just a little bit of, might even be a bit of FUD from somewhere, but they have their concerns, and we have to treat all concerns as valid. And because they have concerns, and they might be angry as an emotion, they might just be very worried, they're not that keen to get involved with a business plan. They're not that keen to deliver something that says, this is why we need to change. And they probably don't even have the budget allocated because nobody's owning it. So you have this vicious cycle occurring where the leadership kind of know they need to do something. The people who report to them are a bit concerned about change, so they don't provide the information, so you haven't got credible data upon which to make decisions, which means people don't take ownership, and the visibility of this as a risk issue, not changing, inertia tax, doesn't bubble up. People focus on their low-level operational issues really well as risks. They're traditionally not very good at dealing with the big stuff. So you're not planning, and confidence is confidence to execute. So if you're not planning ahead and you're not thinking, it could take 9 months to get a good Linux engineer to the point where they're a good cloud architect, you're not talking to the right partners to help execute. If you're not doing all these things to prepare for a big change because you haven't got the data to justify the leadership response for action, nothing happens. And this is a really big risk. So I think we have to try and work with our partners and our customers to try to push out these, these sort of limitations in decision making. And perhaps a good point to start with is to think, what's going on with cloud? So what we've seen so far, I think, is a lot of focus in the early stages on digital workloads and DevOps How can we put that in cloud? Great. Now we're seeing more and more, how do we move all of this legacy stuff into cloud? Maybe shut a few data centers? Great. But we've got a bigger picture, probably a far bigger opportunity for customers and the partners who support them around data. Getting data onto cloud means that the data goes near where the computation happens, which takes place near the user. Once you do that, you're starting to find out a lot more useful things about customers, your business, and how you can leverage knowledge to generate cash. So we have to be a lot more focused, I think, on the bigger opportunity, which is the data and what you do with it. So you'll see a lot from us now on machine learning. So how do we actually help a team of people to effectively agree what they want to do and why before they do it? So the first thing, which I like to do, and please try this in your own companies, is to stick this up and just say, when we talk to people about cloud adoption, they're usually looking for advantage in financial metrics, productivity gains, or improvements in quality risk management. Can you pick three things, just three, that are most important to you in your business? Now, if your organization, your leadership team, whoever, can go that one, and that one, you know they're very clear. If you find that they spend forever debating it, you know it's never going to happen. You need help if that was the case. So if you pick three, you've narrowed it down to three things where you can now look at IT and think, how can I find an IT metric, like, for example, time to get a server up, number of new releases, ability to execute innovation quickly. How can, the percentage of time taken on perhaps value-adding things versus stacking boxes and plugging stuff in. If you can link those IT metrics through to something that's important to the leadership of the business, you're very likely to have a lot of support as IT. And this is essentially what Enel did. So very important to get that first sort of focus on what are the key outcomes that you want. Now, we spoke earlier about TCO. TCO can tell you whatever you want it to tell you. And here's an example we've put together with one of our partners, Red Oak Consulting. It's just illustrative. But we start off with a TCO where you're saying, okay, let's just take a load of boxes and let's compare the cost of that bunch of boxes with AWS on demand on 24/7, every day of the year. Just like you've turned all the lights on in your house and you don't turn them off all year. You're going to have a really high bill. If you do that, cloud makes no sense whatsoever. 10 times plus more expensive. Often a starting point for us. And if you ever want a TCO against cloud to fail, that's the way to do it. But it's not right. We have so many things we haven't included. And we have to try and challenge those perhaps biases or genuine perceptions of where cost lies. So let's add something. Have you got some people? Yes, you do. Right? Well, we want to keep the people, right? We want the people doing more useful things. But the red line's gone up. Now, what about application, what about support and maintenance, procurement and planning? Maybe you've got a year before you deliver anything. What about inflation on the things around cloud which are not related to cloud, like people costs? What about insurance? You have an asset, so you're going to have some insurance on that. Catastrophic risk insurance goes up a little bit. Let's add something else. What about all those data center costs? Now, when people say, well, the data center doesn't count, I'm sorry, but it does. You're either going to decide we're going to exit this data center and sell it, close it, whatever, or we're going to reuse it. You're going to do something with it, but if you've taken applications and workloads out of it and stuck it in cloud, data center costs are no longer relevant. They're now looking at a migration cost there. So we've added data centers. Now, what else? What if we put in capacity planning headroom and applications and servers that support applications and servers? So one of the very first wins that we tend to see in cloud adoption is on-premise IT can be like picking up a small piece of seaweed floating on the ocean and finding out you have a very big bit of seaweed. So I've heard and I've seen reports of about 30 to 40% of the IT estate is applications and servers supporting the applications and servers that are running the business. If you take away that paradigm and you push things to cloud, you've taken away that bloat. Then you've got your capacity headroom. You're going to overbuild because you need to manage risk, whereas with cloud, you just match what you need and what you pay for. So let's add something else. Now I think we're going to add on the utilization. Now the utilization is the key thing. With on-premise, you're having to build stuff, put it in a data center, and whether it's used or not, you've paid for it. Your money is tied up. You're depreciating. The more you add to that, the more you're creating that gap between book value and market value, more of a problem. So with cloud, all you do is pay for what you need to use, hopefully efficiently. And if you do that, you flip the graph. Because when we look at some of our partners and we ask them how much of an on-premise estate is usually utilized, we get answers of between typically something around 5% to 30%. It's a huge amount of underutilized IT estate out there. Now, we know some servers will be production and they'll be very busy, but the overall picture is that they're not. So finally, right, what if we put an internal rate of return on here and we started to look at the value of money? And we applied Moore's law. Well, again, now it extenuates a bit more. Now, what if we applied reserved instances? And if we said, we have all of these EC2 on-demand instances, which are running pretty much all the time, why don't we take a 50 to 70% cost reduction by reserving them? Well, that's what happens. And then we might say, we've got a whole load of compute that's running stuff that could be taken up and taken down very quickly. For example, Hadoop or something, or maybe it's payroll, or maybe it's batch files. So with Spot, you can buy our underutilized capacity at pennies off the dollar sometimes, and run it on the basis of if one of your instances goes down, you shift your compute somewhere else. So if we applied that, it goes down even further. So TCO has to be far more inclusive of what's really being looked at, not just the cost of a box. And that's something that can help a lot of people get a better handle on what they're going to get as an outcome. Another thing which I find to be very helpful is to look at the vision. So you might say, okay, based on your perception of risk and where you are today, okay, first of all, where are you today? Small cloud footprint, big IT footprint, smaller IT footprint, bigger cloud. It's always going to be a mix. So where are you today, and where do you need to be in 3 years' time? Now, if someone goes, well, I'm here today, and I'm going to be here in 3 years' time, that's one conversation. If they say, we're going to be over here, now they've got a big change management challenge that they're going to have to get their coordination around. So we have to make sure that we're keeping the conversation to what our customers want to achieve. By the way, it's very interesting when you actually ask the question, if you were given, say, £20 million and you were told to create a competitor to your existing business and be in the market in 9 months, would you build it on-premise, buy all the stuff, plug it in, get the data center and the rest of it, hire the people, or would you go to cloud? No? If you're saying you're going to build it, well, there had to be a pretty good reason, because that's not what we see in the market for the disruptive companies. The disruptive companies are based on cloud. Another thing is we like to structure the process in which people are making a decision and try to give them a view of what do they have to achieve. And this is very straightforward. It's just basically saying, before jumping into cost-benefit analysis, have you actually documented what you're trying to do and why, got consensus in writing from the people involved in it, so that you're actually agreeing what you're analyzing, and after that, could you put the results of that analysis out there in a way that a non-technical user could understand? Because if you can, you're far more likely to have support at executive level. And again, this is something that Enel did, and I've been told that this is pretty much their process that they came up with. Lastly on this list of what to do with looking at decisions, I think we have to be careful that we're asking the right question at the right time. Usually, I will see a lot of focus on how do we move to cloud, which suppliers, which partners, what do we do with this application, that application. And that happens a long before we actually ask the very basic questions of why change IT platform? What's the real impact of changing IT platform to the business? What are your options? Cloud? Which cloud? Hybrid? What degree of big cloud, small cloud, IT? On-premise? Where would on-premise be right in the short term, the long term? You have to work out the basics. And when is really about window of opportunity. The analysis is not really working out your TCO or value analysis. These are all very snapshot analyses. The when part is thinking, what is the cost of delay? What is the cost of doing things too slow rather than doing things at the right speed? So we have a number of tools which we've got under there as well architected and cloud adoption framework and a number of others. But focusing too heavily, too quickly on how, I believe, is one of the core reasons that decisions don't happen, because nobody's comfortable about the reason behind the decision. So a good example of where this works well, I would give as being Shepard, which is a media company out of Italy, and they came to AWS for support with their business case. They knew what they needed to do in their business case. We just filled some gaps. We have a very good set of models. The result of that was that they were able to communicate to their executives why cloud was important and what they would do, and they've gone amazingly well. Mass migration, now they're going to Lambda and microservices, super organized, and they had help in doing it. It's not trivial. So could these teams that we have in governance, risk, and compliance do more than I used to do when I was, as is, perhaps facetiously called tick boxing, but I have to admit it's not a million miles away, that, because there's a lot of identifying risks, there's a lot of tracking them. I don't think there's a lot of managing them, because managing them needs ownership and it needs accurate data, which you get when you've centralized and simplified, which you get with cloud. You don't get it so much with on-premise IT. So you end up with a form over substance where it's like, great, we have a risk and controls framework. We look at it once every 6 months or something. Well, doesn't really help in the real world. When I had my own business, I invented a technology for recording mobile phone calls from banks. And all the banks left it till the very, very last moment, given 3 years to look at something. They waited till the last minute, and I went from having no revenues to £2 million coming in. And it was an insane number of installations. When I joined one of the big four, I asked an internal audit partner, that was nuts. How did that happen? How did that make sense? And his response was, well, it's record keeping on trading floors. Internal audit will look at that once every couple of years, right? Voice on trading calls once every couple of years. Now, not surprised given the amount of compliance overhead in a bank, but it illustrates the limitations of that approach. There's a lot of changes in a couple of years, as that showed. So we might be looking at things like COBIT, INSA, and others as reducing downside risk, when all we're actually doing is employing a load of people, very intelligent people, by the way, to go around and create a false sense of security. And I'll give you an example of this, right? So a lot of the risk and controls paradigm is if I multiply my risk likelihood by my impact, then I'm going to have a score that I can use. Now, well, think about that, right? First of all, it assumes that I'm reading these questions and these controls, and I understand it exactly the same as the person assessing. It also assumes I know how to score this in a meaningful way rather than just randomly based on my view, but also the way in which you add it up. It's ridiculous. Think about it. If you sat down on a Sunday and you watched, you score 1 to 5 on your risks and controls, and you multiply your impact and likelihood, you get a score, you add them up, that's your risk profile. It's not very good. Think about it. Let's say on a Sunday, you're sitting down and you watch 5 one-star movies. Think of the worst movies you've ever seen in your life. For me, that would be Russell Crowe in Robin Hood, probably something like Made in Manhattan, any of the Transformers franchise, right? If I was to sit down and watch 5 of those all in a row, The logic of risk management, additive weighted scoring is, I am equally happy sitting down watching 7 hours of rubbish as I am sitting down watching one 5-star movie for an hour and a half. It doesn't make sense, does it? Because we haven't taken into account the way in which I assess value in something, my attitude towards it. So I think we have to help our risk and controls people to apply their very systematic, critical point of view towards the way in which decisions are made and the way in which people view risk, rather than trying to artificially measure it in that type of way. So to summarize, I'd say when we're looking at cloud adoption, we're not looking at something that's all about the numbers. We're looking at something that's about people, how they make decisions, how they work together in groups, and whether they are subject to groupthink, chaos because nobody can make a decision, or whether they're quite effective. And cloud needs to appeal to a more risk-averse decision maker. We need to think about people as being afraid, and we need to think, how can we help them address their very legitimate concerns? Because if we don't, we're going to end up with a lot of decision paralysis. That's bad for us because we're not going to get any sort of orders, same with partners. It's bad for customers because their projects won't get started on time. So we need to have a more structured approach to decision making, and this is something that we've developed within AWS to help the risk teams, to help the IT teams, and to help everyone get the same terminology around the same problems and come to a view that's common. So I would go back to saying that a more focused due diligence on the decision-making process and how you're viewing risk is going to, just like that example with the astronaut, is going to determine the outcome that you're going to get. So thank you very much. For any questions? And if you need a seat, let me know. Yeah. What, sorry? Scoring, probability. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's de facto everywhere.
Yeah.
So, you know, what would you say would be an alternative?
Okay. I think we have to look far more at the, we have to start tracking more about the success of the scoring. So if we see, for example, that someone's been scoring something, so for example, statistically, if you've got a whole load of questions and you're asked to score them 1 to 5, for about the first 20, you're going to answer a 3 or 4 most of the time. When you get beyond that, you'll go 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1, 5, and you start to lose the ability to focus on it. Well, that's common. So my view is that you need to start tracking how successfully that scoring is giving a proper view. And I think also we need to start thinking of risk in terms of ranges. How confident are you it's a 3, versus it's a 1 or something? Unless there's some view of how you calibrate that scoring, it's totally random. So I don't think in a more complex view, if you were to start getting into things like Monte Carlo simulations and start thinking it is a set of probabilities, for example, on TCO, whether utilization is going to put it up here or up here, whatever, then you're making far more of a judgment call rather than expecting a magic 8-ball to churn up a number. So I think there's got to be a far more view of how do we look at the data points and come up with a probability view rather than the answer to risk is this. This is our score. Anything else? Well, I'd like to thank you very much for coming. Safe journey back, and I hope you're going to stay for the, the entertainment and drinks afterwards. Thank you.